The 2024 US presidential election is upon us. The whole world is gripped by election fever. So I thought I'd go back and see how some of those US presidents have been depicted on the silver screen. This is the US presidency, according to Hollywood. Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln.
Private Harold Green, sir.
I'm Corporal Ira Clark, sir. 5th Massachusetts Cavalry. We're waiting over there. We're leaving our horses behind and shipping out with the 24th Infantry for the assault next week on Wilmington.
So this is interesting. This shows Lincoln visiting, well, if not the front lines, certainly visiting with the men. And he did this often. He did see action. He saw the front lines. He visited his generals in the field. And he would talk to the men. He visited hospitals as well and talked to wounded rebels in those hospitals. So he was a traveler, Lincoln. He got out there.
Another $3 subtracted from our pay for our uniforms.
That was true, yes, sir. But
Equal pay now, but still no commissioned officers.
I'm aware of that, Corporal Clark.
Yes, sir. That's good that you're aware, sir. It's only
Do you
that
think the Wilmington attack
now
is
that
going to be
white
something
people have accustomed themselves to seeing men with guns fighting on their behalf.
You see African-American soldiers here, that's true. Nearly just under 200,000 African-Americans served in the Union Army. Something like 10% of the entire army. 40,000 of them died. And initially it's true that they were paid less than white troops that they fought alongside, though in 1864 that was corrected and they were given equal pay.
Work, sir. Perhaps you'll hire me.
Perhaps I will.
But you should know, sir, that I get sick at the smell of boot black and I cannot cut hair.
I've yet to find a man who could cut mine so it'd make any difference.
You got spring hair for a white man.
I do. My last barber hanged himself.
I like the way he makes a joke about cutting his hair. I mean, he's got the common touch. He was born in a log cabin. He has not lost the common touch just because he lives in the White House, and he's there joking with the guys about his hair.
We saw you at we were at
We was at Gettysburg.
You boys fight at Gettysburg?
No, we didn't fight there. We just signed up last month. We saw him 2 years ago at the cemetery dedication.
Yeah, we heard you speak. We had damn. Hey, how tall are you anyway?
Gee.
I love the fact they mentioned he's tall. Everyone commented on his height. He was super tall for the time, 6'4", and it didn't help that he then wore the big hat on his head as well. But I love the photographs of him and his generals. Well, him and anyone. He's always towering above them. And as someone who's Lincoln's height, even in the 21st century, the first thing everybody says to me is, how tall are you? So back in the 19th century, Lincoln must have been a freak.
Could you hear what I said?
No, sir, not much. It was...
407 years ago, our fathers brought forth from this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, but dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal.
That's good, thank you.
Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We're met on a great battlefield of that war.
That's good, thank you.
We come to dedicate a portion...
It seems to me that Lincoln's kind of almost embarrassed by the Gettysburg Address and the fact that the men are quoting it back to him. We now know it's probably the greatest speech in the history of the English language, but at the time, it was not that well received. Members of the audience complained they couldn't really hear it. It only went on for a couple of minutes, whereas the other speaker, who was speaking before Lincoln, spoke for 2 hours. And Lincoln went up to him afterwards and said, well, good speech. And the other guy immediately said, I would be amazed in 2 hours if I got across as much as you did in 2 minutes.
That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation under God shall have a new birth.
I think this sets up the fact that people of color in America, African Americans, were frustrated by the slowness of Lincoln. But I think the fact they're able to quote back Lincoln's words to him mean that they do still realize, whilst complaining to Lincoln, they do still realize he's their best chance of achieving social, political, economic equality. Lincoln being played by, well, greatest of all time, Daniel Day-Lewis. There's no one better. They mention they're going to the Battle of Wilmington, which is in early 1865, which then situates the movie right at the heart of 1865 for the big debate around the 13th Amendment, abolition of slavery in the US.
Where the hell are the commissioners?
Oh my God, it's true. You lied to me, Mr. Lincoln. You evaded my request for a denial that there is a Confederate peace offer because there is one. We are absolutely guaranteed to lose the whole thing.
We don't need a goddamn abolition amendment.
What's really interesting about Lincoln's presidency is he brings rivals into his cabinet. He's got, famously, his Secretary of State is William Seward. He's got Chase as Treasury Secretary. He's got Bates, Attorney General. They all ran against him. Some of them were favored to beat him. But Lincoln believed that they would be a stronger team if he brought in people and voices from all sides of the political debate. And we see a heck of a debate going on here.
Leave the Constitution alone.
The peace commissioners appear today, or
state by
worse,
state,
on
you
the
can
morning.
extricate.
I can't listen to this anymore. I can't accomplish a goddamn thing of any human meaning or worth until we cure ourselves of slavery and end this pestilential war.
The background of the scene is that Lincoln knows the war's coming to an end. The Confederacy are on the ropes. And they're already thinking about what comes next. They're very worried about the issue of slavery. Lincoln has issued a presidential proclamation that frees enslaved people, but only in rebel-held areas, only in the Confederacy. There are still slaves that have remained in states that are part of the United States of America, some of the border states and things like that. So they have to work out a solution that's going to be lasting. And this is the attempt to pass a constitutional amendment.
Dodge about like pettifogging Tammany Hall hucksters. See what is before you. See the here and now. That's the hardest thing. The only thing that accounts. Abolishing slavery by constitutional provision settles the fate for all coming time. Not only of the millions now in bondage, but of unborn millions to come.
I love this slide. Not only for the millions now in bondage, but for unborn millions to come. And that is a direct line. We think that is a line that the movie have used, the scriptwriters have used, that was said by Lincoln. So it's not enough to have a proclamation. It's not enough even to pass a law. It has to be a constitutional amendment, a provision which will lock it in. Lock in abolition.
A night and a day and a night, several perfectly good hours. Now get the hell out of here and get him.
Yes. But how?
Buzzard's guts, man. I am the President of the United States of America, clothed in immense power. You will procure me these votes.
You also see Lincoln here frustrated. And this is the key thing about American presidents. We all say they're the most powerful man in the world. The American presidents are curtailed by the Constitution, by what Congress allows them to do. So he says, I am clothed in immense power, and yet I cannot get these representatives to vote for abolition. He controls mighty armies. America is spreading from one ocean to another, and yet he cannot get these people to do what he wants them to do. So he gets very frustrated and he tells his people, force them, find any way you can to get the votes. I want this measure passed for today and for eternity. He knows the importance of what he's doing.
Since we have the floor next in the debate, I thought I'd suggest you might temper your contribution so as not to frighten our conservative friends.
Ashley insists.
This is a powerful scene. The setting is the first thing you notice. They are meeting in the basement. They're down in the cellar where the servants' quarters are, because this is secret. Lincoln doesn't want anyone to know that he's talking to Thaddeus Stevens. Thaddeus Stevens is one of the leaders of the radical Republicans.
Full equality, the no vote, and much more. Congress shall mandate the seizure of every foot of rebel land and every dollar of their property. We'll use their confiscated wealth to establish hundreds of thousands of free Negro farmers, and at their side, soldiers armed to occupy and transform the heritage of traitors. We'll build up a land down there of free men and free women and free children and freedom.
He is way ahead of public opinion on not just emancipation. He doesn't just want to free enslaved people. He wants to be given land. He wants active political measures to fast track them, to intervene and to speed up the process of African Americans achieving political and economic and social equality.
Now we're
working together, and I'm asking you.
For patience, I expect.
When the people disagree, bringing them together requires going slow till they're ready to make up
That's on the people and what they want and what they're ready for. I don't give a goddamn about the people and what they want. This is the
And so Lincoln's like, don't push me too fast. That's why we're meeting in the cellar. He's begging him to step back a little bit from the debate. He's asking him to trust him. Trust me, we're trying to get to the same place. But if you push too hard, you're going to alienate those politicians whose votes we need to pass this amendment. Let the amendment be the beginning of things.
I admire your zeal, Mr. Stevens, and I have tried to profit from the example of it. But if I'd listened to you, I'd have declared every slave free the minute the first shell struck Fort Sumter. Then the border states would have gone over to the Confederacy, the war would have been lost, and the Union along with it. And instead of abolishing slavery, as we hope to do in 2 weeks, we'd be watching helpless as infants as it spread from the American South into South America.
Oh, how you have longed to say that to me.
Lincoln even says, if I'd listened to you, the war would be lost. Lincoln is a pragmatist. He's doing the art of the possible here. Yes, he wants to go further than his public pronouncements on slavery and emancipation suggest. But he knows that he's got to take people with him. He's got to move the political process along. Stevens is just standing in the wings, just throwing bricks through Lincoln's window.
Thought of sharing this country's infinite abundance with
A compass I learned when I was surveying. It'll point you true north from where you're standing. But it's got no advice about the swamps, and deserts, and chasms that you'll encounter along the way. If in pursuit of your destination you plunge ahead heedless of obstacles and achieve nothing more than to sink in a swamp, what's the use of knowing true north?
Lincoln liked to use analogies. He liked to use the words and phrases that he'd learned while living on the frontier, whilst living in rural communities. And I like the idea that we're all heading, true north. We're all heading to the same place. But if you just head on a line straight to true north, you're going to end up in a river or a swamp or lost in the woods. Sometimes you've got to weave your way around, take the firmer ground, and you still end up where you want to be. Stevens gives the best line about Lincoln. He later says that the greatest measure of the 19th century was passed by corruption and abetted by the purest man in America. Just great way to sum up Lincoln. He was a pure man. He was an ideological man. He was a politician of conviction. But he was sometimes forced to stoop to base political tricks to get legislation through. Oppenheimer, President Harry S. Truman.
How's it feel to be the most famous man in the world? You helped save a lot of American lives. What we did at Hiroshima was...
And Nagasaki.
Obviously. Your invention.
We think this meeting took place in the Oval Office in, I think, 25th of October, 1945, so weeks really after Japan's final surrender. So the memory of it would have been very, very fresh. Truman's expecting to have a congratulatory conversation with this rock star scientist. And yet here's Oppenheimer pouring cold water on that achievement and making Truman ask some very important questions about his own role.
International cooperation on atomic energy, and I'm concerned.
Do you know when the Soviets are going to have the bomb?
I don't think I could give you...
Never. Never.
Truman in this meeting is very arrogant. He says that there's no way the Soviets are ever going to develop a nuclear bomb. And yet within a few years, the Soviets will have detonated a nuclear bomb. And the world will enter arguably its most dangerous phase in history, this nuclear arms race, this nuclear standoff between these superpowers, both armed with weapons capable of destroying life on Earth.
Dr. Oppenheimer, if what you say about the Soviets is true, we have to build up Los Alamos, not shut it down.
Mr. President, I feel that I have blood on my hands.
We hear from witnesses that Oppenheimer said he felt he had blood on his hands. And Truman calls him a crybaby scientist.
You think anyone in Hiroshima or Nagasaki gives a shit who built the bomb? They care who dropped it. I did.
He's telling Oppenheimer, no one cares who built the bomb. You may have built the bomb. I gave the order for it to be used. So leave the politics to me. You do the science. I'll handle the geostrategy.
Don't let that crybaby back in here.
I think Harry Truman's one of the most unlikely people ever to become president. His political career was pretty short. In 1934, he decided he wanted to run for US Senate. He was actually the fifth choice of the local power brokers, but in the end, the others dropped out and whatever. He managed to win that Senate seat. He went to Washington in 1935. And in 1940, he won re-election by a 51-49 vote. He wasn't particularly popular, but then he shot to prominence during the war because he headed up a committee looking into kind of government waste, saving money, bringing Main Street values into the world of arms manufacturers and big government interests. So he really boosted his profile. And when the time came in 1944, Roosevelt was looking to change his vice presidential partner. He chose Truman. He selected Truman. It was truly an extraordinary rise to power. And then Roosevelt died. He died in 1945. And Truman was just thrust into the Oval Office. He hadn't been part of the big strategic conversations. He didn't know anything about the Manhattan Project. That means just after a few months in office, Truman is suddenly brought this decision that he alone can make. Should he use the atomic weapon on the battlefield? It's one of the most important and far-reaching decisions in human history. And he decides to do it. And for the rest of his career, for the rest of his life, he insisted that that was the right choice. He talked about the American lives that were saved by not having to invade the Japanese homeland, by knocking the Japanese out of the war with these terrifying nuclear weapons. And he says here in the Oval Office, he says to Oppenheimer, "Your invention, let us bring our boys home." That was the line he stuck to for the rest of his life. But you can see here that Oppenheimer is nervous and worried. And he annoyed Truman. We know from accounts of this meeting that he actually enraged Truman. 13 days, John F. Kennedy.
Marry the meek.
Okay, you better come in here. What was it you were saying to me the other day about Cuba? It wasn't important.
Not as far as the election goes.
Back. I see that for a second.
In this scene, we see Kenneth O'Donnell. He's a special assistant at the White House, so a kind of vague title, but a very, very important advisor to JFK. And he is taken into a room to see photographs taken by a reconnaissance aircraft, a U-2 spy plane. It has flown over the communist-controlled island of Cuba, which sits not very far off the coast of Florida, so very close to mainland USA. And the cameras have spotted something that has sent a chill through the core of the US defense establishment. They've spotted the construction works for Soviet missiles.
You know, last summer I read a book, The Guns of August. I wish every man on that blockade line had read that book. It's World War I. It's 13 million killed. It was all because the militaries of both alliances believed they were so highly attuned to one another's movements and dispositions, they could predict one another's intentions, but all their theories were based on the last war.
JFK felt vulnerable about Cuba. He'd been in office for 2 years. He was young. People have said he lacked experience. He lacked gravitas. And sure enough, he had mishandled an invasion of Cuba, the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, in which Cuban dissidents had attempted to land. It's uncertain what assurances they were given by the Kennedy administration, but that landing and that invasion had been a failure. Kennedy had been embarrassed on the world stage, so he was determined not to be bullied again over the issue of Cuba.
I think one of their ships resists the inspection, and we shoot out its rudder and board. They shoot down one of our planes in response. So we bomb their anti-aircraft sites in response to that. They attack Berlin. So we invade Cuba. And they fire their missiles. And we fire ours.
He's seen war. He's part of that World War II generation. He commanded a PT boat. He commanded a fast, small craft in the Pacific during the Second World War in the Pacific Theater. So he's seen war. He's had his boat sunk. He's had to drag his comrade by holding his life jacket strap in his teeth and swimming to the shore. And so he does not want to ignite a war, particularly not one that could destroy human civilization. And he talks here about the First World War. We understand at the time he was reading a book about the outbreak of the First World War. And he talks about the First World War and how the politicians, the generals, were not brave enough to just pause on that descent, on that charge into conflict in 1914 at the start of the First World War. Because he's a politician, and from his chiefs of staff, from his military establishment, he's being given unanimous advice. Invade Cuba, destroy those launch sites and the missiles on them. And he knows that if he invades Cuba, if he kills Soviet operatives who are manning those sites, if he destroys Soviet military equipment and weapons, then that's war. That's the cause for war. And the world will be tipped into World War III. So here you see Kennedy and the key players in the administration agree that there's going to be not a blockade, but a quarantine. And the idea was that was regarded as just beneath it being an act of war, that all ships would be stopped, they would be searched, and they would be allowed to continue as long as there weren't weapons on board.
And no sign of them stopping.
Quarantine is now in effect.
So here we've got Kennedy saying, start the quarantine, and then we've got the effect on the high seas as US naval vessels get up close with Russian container ships, cargo ships. And what I really like about this, it shows the powder keg of the Cuban Missile Crisis. There are the decisions being taken in Washington and Moscow, sure, in the Oval Office, in the Pentagon, but there's what's happening out there on the high seas. And any of these people you see, these ship's captains, these submarine captains, these merchant marine captains, if they miscalculate, it's war. And in fact, we now know something that Kennedy and none of those other guys knew, that on the 27th of October, there was a Russian submarine and the Americans were dropping non-lethal depth charges, things that would make a bang and try and force the submarine to come to the surface and respect the quarantine. And we now know that there was an argument on board that Soviet submarine. 3 senior officers, 2 of them wanted to launch a nuclear-tipped torpedo. One of them said no. And that one held out, and he saved human civilization. There's an expression. A guy called Vasily Archipov, he saved the world.
It's protecting the freighters.
Bob, is there any way we can avoid stopping a submarine first?
I'm afraid not, Mr. President.
What you really see in this scene, as well as the tension between the different branches of government, different groups within government. You have the military who want to be on the front foot. They're happy and ready to deploy force. And you see the political advisors trying to restrain the military, causing a lot of frustration. And indeed, those political advisors do things like intervene. They intervene to tell the unit that's flying those reconnaissance flights over Cuba not to report that they have been shot at, that they've actually sustained damage. Because they know that if US planes have been shot at and have sustained damage from enemy troops, that the US is going to have to respond. So people like O'Donnell are just trying to put out fire, do what they can to try and hold back the impetus, stop that slide into total war.
Captain, force the sub to the surface.
Yes, Mr. President. Prepare to fire torpedoes.
Prepare to fire torpedoes, aye, sir.
Prepare to launch ASROC.
Prepare to launch ASROC, aye, sir.
You see in this scene, this naval vessel about to fire torpedoes, about to drop depth charges. And luckily, the ships turn around, they call it off, and there's enormous relief.
What are you up to?
Slowing down.
These politicians literally thought they were standing on the blink of nuclear oblivion. But there would be many of these run-ins, and not all of them would be as clean-cut as that.
That the ships appear to be stopping.
Captain, belay that order. Belay that order.
Hold your fire!
Bob, where's that coming from?
1 second, Mr. President.
Somebody find out what's going on.
Those ships are definitely stopping.
Some are turning around.
Are they stopping?
I don't know what the hell they're doing.
Admiral? Admiral, what's happening?
Yes, sir, they are stopping.
Mr. President, reports are coming in from all around. The ships are stopping.
What you do see eventually in this movie is the Kennedy brothers taking a big risk and really going around the back, just using unofficial diplomacy to cut out the whole of the US government. They go direct in private to the Soviet ambassador and they make a kind of verbal agreement that if the Soviet Union removes nuclear warheads from Cuba, the Americans will remove their nuclear warheads from Turkey. And although that's never signed up to, it's never made public, that is an agreement. And sure enough, the US government does remove those warheads from Turkey. And that backroom conversation, that secret personal deal, is probably the real reason that the Cuban Missile Crisis didn't turn into global thermonuclear war. As a result of this crisis, Kennedy worked towards installing a hotline between Washington and Moscow. It's hard for us to believe, but there wasn't actually a direct way of those people talking, the US president and the Soviet premier talking before then. So that was a very important moment to avoid conflict, to deconflict arguments before they got out of control. And the Cuban Missile Crisis and its aftermath is often seen as Kennedy's greatest achievement in office. He saved the world from nuclear oblivion, apparently without giving away too many of US national interests. But his presidency wouldn't really get to develop from there on, because less than a year later, he was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. All the way, Lyndon B. Johnson.
Their first nuclear test at their new site in eastern Kazakh.
All right, talk to me, Hubert.
Well, the good news is we've got a deal with Dirksen.
And what's the bad news?
We're 2 votes short.
The funny thing about Johnson and JFK is JFK is remembered as this kind of liberal icon, but Johnson did a lot more. He was the one who drove through civil rights legislation. And this scene is all about that. So to pass legislation smoothly through the Senate, you need 67 senators to vote for it. If you have less than that, then individual senators can hold up legislation almost indefinitely. And that's what was going on right here as this scene is being acted out. And Johnson is personally lobbying senators he thinks might be wavering, he thinks might be persuadable. He's personally lobbying them to try and get them to come out, break the filibuster, and get this civil rights legislation through.
Boy, oh boy, look at you. How you feeling? Fine. Well, listen, I need to talk to you about something.
Nice cufflinks, Mr. President.
Well, you like these? Do you?
I do.
Well, then they are yours.
No.
And I love this, but he catches a guy in the lift. William Fulbright's a senator from a southern state, and it's his fellow Southern Democrats that are holding up this legislation.
Well, it's a pretty tough sell for Humphrey's crowd, but if you were to support the Civil Rights Bill, they'll just grin and bear it.
But this senator here, Fulbright, he's one of those, but Johnson thinks he's persuadable. I love it. He's asking how he is. He gives him his cufflinks. He says they're so good. He says they're the only 2 in the world.
Maybe when the vote comes up, you happen to be overseas visiting our troops. I'm sure Elizabeth would love Europe. You know she would.
He says, just go to Europe, visit the troops. You don't have to be there. I don't definitely need your vote. I just need you not to be there and abstain and bring down that 2/3 threshold by 1 vote. And Johnson had been in the Senate since the 1940s. Johnson was a real Washington man. He knew how to get legislation through Congress.
I'm gonna need another set of those cufflinks.
Bryan Cranston is fabulous as Johnson in this movie. He's physically imposing. He's an arch political operator. He didn't like being vice president, but then he was thrust into the top job when JFK was assassinated. It's an incredible achievement by Johnson, who was not a politician who excited public passion. He's not someone who is remembered as one of the great orators or leaders in US history, but there is no one better than Lyndon Johnson for the nitty-gritty, the business of driving legislation through. And that civil rights legislation that he passed transformed America.
It's obvious that this Deputy Price was involved in that. Probably the sheriff, too. Oh, Lord. Oh, this whole mess is in my lap now. If I don't charge these bastards, then King yells and I'm letting them get away with murder. But if I do charge them, then all the Southerners scream about how I'm taking orders from the And all this 2 weeks before the start of the goddamn convention.
This scene is so good because it shows all the different pressures coming from different directions on US presidents. It shows the domestic, the political, and the foreign considerations all being bundled up. You can see that Johnson's frustrated because if he prosecutes the sheriff, then it'll drive white Southerners crazy. If he doesn't prosecute him, he says Martin Luther King will be all over me. So Johnson always felt like he was being pushed and pulled and bullied from either side. We know that he swore a lot, he's very emotional, and he was furious about always having to triangulate. He's either doing too much or not enough on civil rights. He's doing too much in foreign affairs or not enough. He's constantly walking this tightrope.
Mr. President, I'm sorry to have to tell you, but the word is Governor Wallace has offered himself to Goldwater as the Republican vice presidential candidate.
That little weasel would sell his mother to get a leg up.
And Strom Thurmond is formally switching parties.
Is anybody gonna follow him?
Well, I don't know.
We'll find out.
His mind's clear on the presidential election. It's coming up, 1964. He's got a few months to go. The convention's coming up, he says. And there's bad news coming in. Southern Democrats are defecting. Governor Wallace, a leading Southern Democrat, he is offered to go on the Republican ticket as Barry Goldwater's vice presidential candidate. Strom Thurmond, another Democrat, Southern Democrat, like Johnson, a Southern Democrat, he has defected to the Republicans as well. So Johnson feels like he's under enormous pressure, and then someone comes in and just drops a big foreign policy problem right on his plate. And that is what it is to be the American president.
Yeah, sit down. All right, Robert.
Captain Herrick of the USS Maddox reports a potential sighting last night of two possibly hostile unidentified vessels in the Gulf of Tonkin, and some somewhat contradictory sonar evidence of actual torpedo attack.
There's been an incident in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of Indochina, what is now Vietnam. The US at that time had not committed ground troops to Vietnam. They were supporting the South Vietnamese with weapons and supplies and expertise, trying to get them to defeat us or hold their own against the North Vietnamese that were communists. But the US at this point was not engaged in land warfare in Vietnam. This would change under Johnson's presidency. It would start to change right here, because it's not clear what happens in the Gulf of Tonkin. Something happens, word's going to get out. Johnson is so worried he's going to be made to look weak, soft on defense in an election year. And so not for the last time and not for the first time, an American president makes a military decision for political reasons.
Do it.
Yes, sir.
If it gets out, we'll pass it off on our South Vietnamese allies.
Mr. President.
What, you think I like this? Putting my ass in a sling this close to the election?
Sir.
Or maybe you think Goldwater ought to be president, is that it?
Never said
that. Maniac wants to lob an A-bomb into the Kremlin's bathroom and start World War III. You see how you like that?
Mr. President, come on.
Goldwater gets elected, you can forget about poverty. You can forget about civil rights. Is that what you want?
He keeps saying, and I love this gets the heart of the Johnson's presidency. He says to his vice president, just do some airstrikes, pass a resolution, and then we can get back to the things we care about. We get back to poverty, healthcare, education, civil rights legislation. And that would be Johnson's downfall, because he would be dragged into Vietnam, trying not to look weak. That would come to define his presidency. It would come to break him, and it would end his presidency. And it would overshadow everything he was trying to do domestically. And you get a sense of that in this key meeting in the Oval Office.
Pass some kind of resolution authorizing me full authority over there. And then we can get back to the things that really matter.
And Johnson's right. Congress did pass the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in August 1964, just after this meeting. And in retrospect, that really is a major milestone on American greater and deeper involvement in the Vietnam War. Within a year, there would be American ground troops fighting. There would be boots on the ground in Vietnam. And within a couple of years, it would consume the national political conversation, just elbowing out all of Johnson's other hopes and dreams for his legislative agenda. Frost Nixon, Richard M. Nixon.
At least we are, that you got this all together.
Oh, thank you.
I understand it. It's been quite a struggle.
Well.
How much has it cost?
This is the story of the most unlikely interview in history. Nixon leaves the White House in disgrace. He resigns just before he's pushed in August 1974. He doesn't speak to the media for nearly 3 years. In the end, he does do a sit-down interview with a British, not very well-known interviewer called David Frost, who bets the farm on securing this interview. He spends a huge amount of money to secure Nixon. And so they're having this chit-chat at the start. Frost is nervous. Nixon comes across as an elder statesman. He's confident. He's suave. And he is going to set the record straight. He'd been humiliated by the so-called Watergate scandal, the election interference scandal, and the scandal of covering up what might have happened, what might have been ordered by his White House. He'd had to leave office in disgrace, but now he's back, and he wants to have his say.
My upper lip before answering it, which you won't show when you cut it together. You're probably aware of my history with perspiration.
If you're referring to your TV debate with Jack Kennedy in 1960?
They say that moisture on my upper lip cost me the presidency. People who heard it on the radio, well, they thought I'd won. Yeah. The television and the close-up, they create their own sets of meanings. So now they insist I bring a handkerchief.
I really like this bit, this little Easter egg here, which talks about his sweaty upper lip. Because there was a great moment in 1960 when he lost a very, very, very close election to JFK, John F. Kennedy. And they did the first TV debate, and he was seen to be a little bit sweaty. And so people that watched the TV thought he was less attractive. He lost that debate. People that listened on the radio thought he'd won. And that is seen as the dawn of the media age. From that point onwards, you've got to have TV-friendly politicians. And Nixon always hated the TV from that moment on. He hated the media. He thought the media had a liberal bias. They were biased against him. They'd put the boot into his regime. But this was his chance. He thought David Frost was a soft option. He'd throw him softball questions, and he'd be able to get his story out there.
More clearly than that.
Let me just stop you now right there, because you're doing something here, which I am not doing and I will not do. Throughout these entire broadcasts, you're quoting me out of context, out of order, and I might add, I have participated in all these interviews without a single note in front of me.
Well, it is your life, Mr. President. Now,
This scene is the best scene in the movie. It's so important. It's the pivotal scene. Because in this, you see when Nixon, who in his previous interviews with Frost, he's just steamrolled him. He's got no chance. This young British guy against an old statesman like Nixon, he's talked his way out of trouble before. He's just monologued and hasn't given Frost the chance to jump in. But this time Frost is coming off the ropes and he's got a jab, and he starts to talk about the cover-up with Watergate.
Well, it was being delivered on the tops of phone booths with aliases, and at airports by people with gloves on. That's not normally the way lawyers' fees are delivered.
Look, I have made statements to this effect before. All that was Haldeman and Ehrlichman's business. I knew nothing. Okay, fine. You made a conclusion there. I stated my view. Now let's move on. Let's get on with the rest of it.
Hold on.
I don't want to continue this.
Nixon's support for his members of staff who tried to funnel that money to those perpetrators. And Nixon, he catches Nixon.
Cover up of another kind.
Well, maybe I should have done that. Maybe I should have just called the feds into my office and said, hey, there's the two men. Haul them down to the dock, fingerprint them, and then throw them in the can. Look, when you're in office, you gotta do a lot of things sometimes that are not always, in the strictest sense of the law, legal. But you do them because they're in the greater interests of the nation.
Right, wait.
And Nixon admits in this scene here, which all remember is actually constructed from the transcript of the original interview. Nixon admits that he believes...
I'm saying that when the president does it, that means it's not illegal.
That when the president does something, it's not illegal. And that goes against everything that we believe in Western democracies. So David Frost manages to get this tiny admission out of Nixon that has come to define that president's entire career.
No one else shares that view.
So, in that case, will you accept then, to clear the air once and for all, that you were part of a cover-up and that you did break the law?
He does go on to say in this interview that he let the American people down. I let the country down, and he is carrying that burden with him for the rest of his life. And that's why this is such a brilliant portrayal. He comes across as bullshy and confident, but there is an admission of wrongdoing in those eyes.
I let down the country. And worst of all, I let down our system of government. and the dreams of all those young people that ought to get into government, but now they think, oh, it's all too corrupt and the rest. Yeah. I let the American people down.
Nixon was impeached in the House of Representatives. He was not impeached in the Senate because he resigned before then. He was then issued with a blanket pardon. So in a way, the American people never got to see Nixon in the dock. They never got to see him forced to explain himself. And this was as close as they got. This interview is as close to a trial of Richard Nixon as you'll ever see. And in it, he admits he was doing things that he knew were illegal at the time. At the very least, he was covering up for those people working for him that were trying to cover up the Watergate scandal. Vice, George W. Bush.
Distance myself from my years at Yale and Harvard, make me more of a man of the people for the election.
Smart.
George Bush was from a very, very wealthy family. He did grow up in Texas. He then went to a very smart private school in the Northeast, in New England, and went to Yale and Harvard. But he returned to Texas to become governor and enter the oil business. So it's not entirely fair to say he's a total plastic Texan. He's a complete fake Texan. But this scene then goes on to show this all-important relationship between George W. Bush and the man that will become his vice president, Dick Cheney.
I want you to be my VP. You're the solution to my problem.
I'm CEO of a large company. I have been Secretary of Defense. I have been Chief of Staff. The vice presidency is mostly a symbolic job.
Right. I can see how that wouldn't be enticing to you.
George Bush was from a political dynasty. His father had been president. His grandfather had been a US senator. He had dabbled in politics. He's become governor of Texas. And he then thought about making a run for the White House in the year 2000. His big concern is he didn't have the gravitas. He didn't have the political experience. He didn't have the weight to convince people to vote for him. In fact, he initially was quite worried about just the Republican, the right wing of American politics. There were awkward facts about his past that might alienate the white evangelical base of the Republican Party. And he thought that by bringing on this vice president, Dick Cheney, he could broaden the ticket, strengthen the ticket, shore up his right flank, and allow him to take on the Democrats.
However, the vice presidency is also defined by the president. If we were to come to
I love the fact that director Adam McKay uses this imagery here of fly fishing. You dangle the fly on the water to excite the fish take a look at it, and then the fish bites. He's fishing for George W. Bush like he'd fish for a juicy trout in the rivers of Wyoming.
Based on instinct.
I am. People always said that.
Yeah. Very different from your father in that regard. Now, maybe I can handle some of the more mundane jobs, overseeing bureaucracy, managing military, energy, foreign policy.
The best line in this scene is when he said, maybe if I could get oversight of some of the more mundane jobs, like the bureaucracy. Well, that is the US government. Energy, essential. And the military, defense. The US is the biggest military power in the history of humankind. That's a big job. And then he also says foreign policy, which has traditionally been the preserve of the President of the United States. Cheney here is talking about most of the functions, most of the powers of the presidency. And George W. Bush, he's happy to go along with it.
That sounds good.
I like the way Cheney says, the vice presidency is not really a great job. It's not a proper job. It's a symbolic role. And this conversation, which a version of it seems to have taken place, in which George W. Bush agreed that he would give Cheney a bigger role in government than most vice presidents. He would give him sweeping powers within the fields of regulation, of energy, and in defense. And that would prove to be pretty important because George Bush's administration would be defined by the events of 9/11 and the wars that sprang from that, which gave the vice president, Dick Cheney, as the defense lead, huge say in what would happen.
Looks like it's time to take a rag.
It is about goddamn time.
called the Office of Special Plans. Tenet is not yet serious enough without the threat that Saddam poses, a global war on terror.
This shows the Office of Special Plans, which was a Pentagon unit that was designed to sort of fast-track intelligence to the Oval Office, to President Bush, that would give him useful fodder to go to war with Iraq. It did not go through the usual intelligence channels with the usual vetting processes, and that much is true, but we see that Cheney, in the movie it presents Cheney as like the key driver of this process. I think in reality, he's been made into a bit of a boogeyman here. I think George W. Bush was more involved than he's made out to be.
So tonight, we'll go on in the hopes of an oppressed people. Travis spoken.
Polling for an invasion of Iraq is at 53%. A focus group show people still aren't sure about a connection between Saddam and Al-Qaeda.
You see a version of discussion which I think may well have taken place because you have Condoleezza Rice in there, you have Colin Powell, former Joint Chief of Staff, you have Donald Rumsfeld there, Defense Secretary, you have Karl Rove, who's Bush's vital advisor, Chief of Staff, Bush's brain, and they're all revolving around the president, trying to get him to make up his mind.
Immediate threat.
That's not good. I really want a strong coalition for this.
I have an idea. Secretary Powell has the highest trustworthy ratings of all of us. What if he gave an address to the UN and the American people to push this over the finish line?
Carl, I have been very vocal about my reservations about invading Iraq.
No, Colin, you're such a nervous Nelly.
We are talking about invading a sovereign nation without any provocation, Don. It is a sovereign nation, Don.
You know what's so interesting? In other movies that we reviewed, you see the president as the dynamic central character in a scene. Here it seems the president's quite passive and all of these characters are trying to influence him. Not least Dick Cheney, who strolls up to him, physically seems to dominate the room.
Enough of that, guys. You gonna take Saddam down or not? You are the president. War is yours. And you and some coalition do not share powers that are yours alone. George, make sure Powell sees the intelligence.
Sir.
Colin, I want you to make that speech. I'm president, and I want this to happen.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Historians, I think, do agree that this administration was one of powerful characters seeking to influence the president. It was not coming, direction was not coming top down. And Cheney, this great line saying, Cheney says, don't give away your power, you're the president, which is pretty ironic because Cheney's taking Bush's power at every opportunity. But where it suits Cheney, he builds up Bush and says, you make sure you insist, you're the president. And Bush tells Colin Powell to go and give that fateful UN briefing where he humiliates himself, he presents intelligence that later turns out to be fake and leads inexorably to the end of Colin Powell's career, but also the start of active operations in Iraq.
Visible for you?
Yeah. Bring it a little closer, yeah. How's my hair? My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war. These are opening stages of what will be a broad and concerted campaign.
All presidents read the auto cue, but filmmakers are exaggerating the way that he was just seen as a cipher. He's seen as somebody speaking words that have been put into his mouth by Dick Cheney, by Karl Rove, by some other powerful interest. And right there as George Bush is reading the words that other people have written, his ankle is just tapping up and down. And that's a great insight into the human side of the presidency. He's aware of what he's saying. He's aware that he's about to unleash enormous forces that will spiral way outside his control. But also I love this scene because it brings us back to the heart of the presidency, the man, or maybe the woman one day, sitting in the chair behind that resolute desk in that Oval Office. The decisions taken there, in that spot, affect the lives of everybody on Earth. War and peace, nuclear weapons, democracy, the environment, and all the presidents we've talked about today have had a massive impact on subsequent history. Well, folks, I hope you enjoyed that. There are many, many more of these reviews to check out, so please like and subscribe, check out the other videos, and don't forget to tell us what you think in the comments below.